everybody. Just gassed up. Didn't really need to, but I did anyways. So I filled up one of my little 20-liter tanks, and this guy here was like telling me, I don't know, he gave me a bunch of change. She's all weird and stuff and whatever. And, but anyways, yeah, I don't know. That guy there, was that like 27 bucks? I mean, no, that's wrong, sorry. Was that like, filling up my 20-liter tank, and when I hit the 20-liter line, I was at 27 bucks. I mean, 27 liters. So I asked the guy if his tanks were off, or if it's my gas tank that's off, or something like that. You know, because first he's like, it's a 25-liter tank. I'm like, nope, 20-liter. So he's telling me that in cold weather, 20 liters changes to 30 liters. I don't know about that. The Gen7 here, I don't know. Cheap gas, but is it cheap gas, or are they ripping people off? Right? Does the cold weather affect the gas that much? That 20 liters turns into 30 liters? I don't know about that. And it gives me all this change. Fuck, I could have given him a nickel and got 20 back. Fucking douchebag. What a jerk. Let's look that up. Hey Google, what does 20 liters of gas change to when it's cold outside? Hey Google, what's 20 liters of gas in cold weather? How much more gas do you get when it's cold? Cold weather and winter driving conditions can significantly reduce fuel economy. Fuel economy tests show that in city driving, a conventional gasoline car mileage is roughly 15% lower at 25 20 degrees Fahrenheit than it would be at 77 degrees Fahrenheit. It can drop as much as 24% for short 3 to 4 mile trips. Hey Google, in cold weather, what's the difference with 20 liters of gas? How many liters is that when it's cold weather? Hey Google, when I pump 20 liters at the tank, how much do I actually get when it's cold outside? Hey Google, how much extra do I get when I pump 20 liters of gas? Hey Google, what's 20 liters of fuel in cold weather? Google ain't giving me an answer. Darn you, Google. So yeah, is the Gen7 ripping people off? I don't know. I'm gonna figure that out. I'm gonna look into that. It doesn't seem right. 27 liters of fuel in a 20-liter tank. Yeah, I don't know.
Drugs, which is this massive, incredible billion-dollar industry, but it seems that the husband killed his wife and then killed himself. So that was the original reason why people went crazy about this story.
Why did you want to get into telling the story? Part of this is the connections in the city and in the community that you mentioned.
Well, I'm a member of the Jewish community, although somewhat on the side of it. I wasn't as deep as some people are. So it was interesting and close to home in a weird way. Also, I'm a born-bred Torontonian, and it appealed to me. And any story, I mean, I now make podcasts for a living, and I knew that there was so much to this story to unpack, so much about who they were, how when you die, there can be multiple theories about who wanted you dead. I knew instinctively that there was a long, nuanced, interesting, engaging story to tell.
What was the story that you wanted to tell? Because people have been covering the story in different ways since the murders happened. What was the story that you wanted to tell?
I wanted to look into who they were. To me, that's always been my drive, my focus in what I do. Who were these people? How did they become who they were? How did they interact? How did they affect the people around them? And then we don't get into, I say this from the very beginning, I don't solve the murder. Sure, I'd love to, but I don't, and nor did anyone on my team think that we were going to get there. But I did want to try to figure out who these people were, because they were no good and terribly kind, and they lived wonderful lives, but they also were disliked.
Within the Jewish community, you talk about degrees of separation. I mean, just explain for people who don't know how closely knit that community in the biggest city in the country actually is.
It's so close. So I'm Jewish, both of my parents are Jewish. I did grow up sort of on the outside of that community, just a choice that my parents made, but my cousins, especially on my dad's side here, are right in it. And so I tell my cousins I'm working on this story, and one cousin tells me, oh, I golfed with Honey. She was really obnoxious on the golf course. And another cousin who's a real estate agent happens to work in the same company and is friends with the agent that the families was over at my sister's. He's only 1 degree of separation.
Verner 16, Subway 88. Yeah, I don't know, man. There's something wrong with people these days. Everyone seems to be a jerk. That guy at the Gen7 was not helpful at all. Ignorant and rude, that guy. the outskirts of Sturgeon Falls here. Share the road, stay in your lane.
Was murder-suicide, and it took them 6 weeks to change their mind. And I'm not a police investigator, but I wonder in those 6 weeks what they missed and what they can't get back after 6 weeks of not.
After 6 weeks, the police say that this is not, they don't believe it's a murder-suicide.
Like I said, they never actually came out and said it was a murder-suicide, but after 6 weeks they held a press conference and announced that they now believed it was a double homicide and that they were targeted. And so something within those 6 weeks changed. What we do know is that Brian Greenspan's group, which included former homicide detectives, pathologists, did a second investigation, including a second look at the autopsy, went to them with specific information, including finding certain things underneath the belt that were on their necks and some ligature marks on their hands. The police have never said for sure, but Brian Greenspan says that it was his investigation that pushed the police to announce that they were now seeing this as a double murder.
And this was an investigation, a side investigation that was put together, funded, and prompted by the family itself.
Absolutely, because the day that the police came out with their murder-suicide theory, obviously the family was very upset about it, and so they decided, and they had the resources to actually hire their own investigative team.
As you mentioned, this is the story of the deaths of these two individuals, but it's also the story of their lives. And you do this really neat thing where, to tell the story of the Shermans, you give voice to Barry Sherman himself. Have a listen to this.
I have always been very conscious of my personal mortality. I have enjoyed considerable success in building the Apotex group of companies, which probably will survive me. However, memories are brief, and even should there survive some physical manifestation of my existence, my thoughts will be forever lost unless I commit them to paper.
What is that?
That is Canadian actor Saul Rubinek playing Barry, reading from Barry's unfinished autobiography called The Legacy of Thoughts.
And this is something Barry Sherman himself wrote.
Oh yeah, so he started writing it while he was on a family vacation in Africa, and he never finished it, but he started writing his autobiography, and it came out in a deposition, so it was public access, and so it was a wonderful tool, because I've done a lot of true crime work, and so often, obviously you don't get the voice of the person that it's about because they're no longer with us, but we had an opportunity here to actually bring Barry to life and to place him, and as best we could. It's unfinished. There's still a million things that I wish Barry had talked about in his autobiography, but we got a chance to hear from Barry.
The readings that Saul Rubinek does are fascinating, just in the tone that he takes. And part of that speaks to what the text says. What did you learn about Barry Sherman through those readings?
That he seemed to care about business more than anything else in his whole life. That he just certainly doesn't spend a lot of time on his family. He hardly mentions Honey, rarely mentions his children, and spends a lot of time on very detailed descriptions of business. Barry is was obsessively, aggressively focused on business. And what's interesting to me was we read that, and then the parallels to who he was in life and the way that he was notoriously litigious. Even to the point where we spoke to one of his former lawyers who told us that he would say to Barry, you have to stop. This case, you're not winning it. It's aggressive. It's taking money from the company that you will never get back. And Barry would say to him, whose money am I spending? My money? Do your job. Keep up with this litigation. I don't care that I win or not. It's the principle. And so it became very clear to me that Barry's one true love was his business.
That comes out, this is a strange thing to reference, but that comes out in some ways through the funeral as well. And you analyze in some ways what is said at the funeral for the Shermans. This is their son speaking. This is Jonathan.
Our mother always had everything taken care of. Our father was an amazing dad. We clearly knew why our dad wasn't always present. He was a pretty busy guy. but I can remember literally every single individual occurrence when my dad did father stuff with me. He would come watch me play hockey or baseball once every season or two. But those few games were my Stanley Cups and my World Series.
It's an incredibly sad and poignant moment for the family. What did you take away from it?
I found it heartbreaking. His dad came to his games every other year.
Once every couple of seasons.
I mean, and then you do wonder what he was crying about. Was he, I mean, obviously he lost his father and he's crying about his dad being gone, but he didn't see his dad very often. And what I found was, you know, there were well over 2,000 people at that funeral, including the Prime Minister of Canada. So it was a performance. It wasn't an intimate experience for them, but I found it very surfacey. I didn't really get it. You know, so many times you go to a funeral and you sort of laugh through your tears, or you feel that there's this incredible warmth that comes through because the people speaking about the people that they lost, you know, it's so poignant. And that didn't appear. There was a lot of conversation about Barry's business and his money. And there was a lot of talk about Honey's giving and that Honey was good at organizing. But I didn't hear any of the humanity. And I don't know why that is, but it made me sad. And then to hear Jonathan say that he remembers every occurrence that he spent with his dad. I don't remember every occurrence that I've spent with my father because my father's there all the time. Even now, if you know a Jewish family, he's always there. But that wasn't the case for the Shermans.
What did that tell you about who this couple was? I mean, because it's not just from the family members at that funeral. To your point, it's other people who are saying similar things as well.
Well, in the police reports, one of the Sherman children did mention that there was the private Shermans and the public Shermans. And so it was very hard to get to the private Shermans for sure. There were not a lot of people talking about them. They were still circling the wagons. They didn't want to talk. So I can't say that I got close as close as I wanted to get. But what I did find was that who they were in terms of how much money they had and what they did with it was the identity that they carried around with them. And that it affected their relationships with their children, their friends, their business partners, and the people that they worked with.
What do you mean? Part of this, and you say this early on in the podcast, that this is about the individuals, it's about their deaths, but it's also about money and what money, that amount of money can do to somebody.
I mean, I've come to the realization that I don't want $2 billion. It's too much money.
It's easy for us to say.
It's easy to say, but, you know, and we're all obsessed with it. I mean, we talk about Succession actually later on in the podcast, and I think that's one of the reasons why that show is so popular. It's a great show, obviously. There's so much more that is the reason, but as a society, we're so fascinated by the wealthy, and it's partly because I think so much of us, we want to be wealthy. But that much money, you don't know who loves you for what. It's just, it becomes too much of who you are, and it makes people just see the money. And I think that comes out in their lives and then in their deaths, that it all comes down to their money. And I feel like that is something that I've come to realize is not something that I want or that is particularly good for anybody.
The money came from his generic drug manufacturing business. Just explain what that, for people who don't know what that is and how Barry Sherman made that money, what it was that he was, you hinted at the litigation part of it earlier, but what was the business that he was involved in that made him who he was?
So generic drugs are a copy drug of a already established drug that Big Pharma has developed and been sold. And what happens is these Big Pharma drugs have patents on them, but then these patents run out. And so then it's generic drug companies that try to copy the drug, and there are a lot of rules around how specifically they have to be copied, and then they can start to sell those drugs. And what happens is they can sell them for less because they don't have to put the money into the development of the drug and that kind of thing. And there's so much good that comes from generic drugs. I mean, people, and especially Apotex too was involved in it, like AIDS in Africa, wouldn't have had the success it's had in terms of managing it if it wasn't for generic drugs, because people and countries can afford generic drugs. But the industry itself is this scrappy balancing the line between legal and criminality. We spoke to one person who's done a lot of work looking at generic drug industries and basically says that, the industry is close to being an organized crime syndicate. That they push the lines on when they can start to sell their drugs. They fight within each other quite significantly, both physically and in the courts, about fighting for those patents and when they can jump off.
Because there's extraordinary amounts of money.
There's extraordinary amounts of money. So, like the first person to use the generic Xanax or Viagra, once those patents ran out on the big pharma drugs, on the brand name drugs, if you could be the first to market on Viagra as generic, that is less expensive, you are going to make millions and millions of dollars. And that is what Barry was so good at. So that litigious nature that he had was perfect for the generic drug industry, because you needed to be scrappy, you needed to be focused, you needed to not care what other people thought of you, because you needed to just go after that patent and make that drug.
And that's what made him successful, was that tenacity,
the drive,
willingness to fight.
Other people have told us that Barry saw making money as a game. He didn't care about the money. He drove an old car. He didn't dress well. He flew economy. So it had to be something else that was driving this man to be so focused on that. And using your word, he was tenacious and dogged after the game of within the generic drug industry.
Do you think that made him a target?
100%. Absolutely. And there's a lot of people that told us that if somebody was targeting, it's very possible that it was somebody within the generic drug industry.
What are the other theories? Again, there are all sorts of, some are wilder than others, but what are the other theories that are out there as to what happened?
Hitman, either generic drug or big pharma. The family, that there was a massive 10-year fight between Barry Sherman and his first cousins, which are the Winter brothers, although the police seems to have dismissed him as a suspect, and he himself admits that he was a suspect, especially one of them. Then it just goes down rabbit holes. So there's Mossad, which makes no sense because the Shermans were very, very generous toward Israel, but there's somebody down some rabbit hole decided that they were going after them. The Canadian government, because apparently Barry had some secret that he was hiding from the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister decided he needed to keep him quiet. There's the Russian mafia, because there's some strange fentanyl, weird conspiracy about that. And then there's still murder-suicide. Nobody's completely figured out why that was dismissed so quickly.
Where's the investigation into this? The family recently, in the 5th year anniversary, increased the reward for information that would lead to some sort of resolution of this.
Yeah.
Where's the investigation right now from the police perspective?
Well, there's one police officer working on the case. They insist it's not a cold case, but there's one police officer. He seems to spend a lot of his time in court, either arguing with media about releasing information. Other than that, they do not communicate with us. We tried to speak to them on a number of occasions, and they won't tell us where they are with the investigation. But a couple of years ago, they came out with this grainy video of a man walking down the street and said that he was a person of interest, but where that went, we don't know. But that's it. And now there's $35 million on the table from the family. But if $10 million, which was what it was before, isn't going to convince somebody to come forward, I don't know what $35 million is going to do, but they now have upped the reward for any information.
How do you think people will react to you telling this story?